Elon Musk is touting this AI. He says, it's really, in a way, quite terrifying to see what it's doing.
This is the smartest AI in the world. Things are just worth repeating. Like Grok 4 is PhD level in everything.
There is a number buried inside the first sentence of the Bible. Not hidden in some secret vault, not encrypted by monks in a candlelit scriptorium. Just sitting there, in plain Hebrew, for 3,000 years. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. 7 words, 28 letters. 7 multiplied by 4. And if you know where to look, the pattern doesn't stop there. It cascades. It multiplies. It shows up in places no 13th century scribe could have planned. Because the chapter and verse divisions we use today didn't even exist when the text was written. This is a story about artificial intelligence uncovering some divine access code. That version, the one about panicked graduate students, and an AI called Grok breaking down a 4-step prayer protocol, is not a real study. There's no verifiable Dr. Marcus Chun at Stanford, no Dr. Sarah Okonkwo at MIT. No research team that fed every prayer in the Bible into a chatbot and lost sleep over what came back. It's a piece of viral fiction dressed up as science, built to look real enough that you'd believe it, and built to make you feel like you were being let in on something forbidden. But here's what's strange. The real story doesn't need the fake one. Because for over 100 years, actual mathematicians, actual linguists, and actual biblical scholars have been arguing, seriously, sometimes bitterly, about whether the Bible really does contain a hidden numerical structure. Some of them built entire careers on it. Some of them spent 50 years of their lives on it. And the debate is still not settled today. So let's talk about what's actually true. In 1855, in Russia, a boy named Ivan Panin was born into a world that had no particular interest in religion. As a young man, he became a nihilist, the kind of radical who plotted against the Tsar's government. Eventually, that got him exiled. He drifted through Germany, then made his way to the United States, where he enrolled at Harvard and built a reputation as a formidable literary critic, sharp, skeptical, and by his own account, a committed agnostic. He wasn't looking for God. If anything, he was the last person anyone expected to spend the second half of his life defending the Bible. Then, in 1890, something changed. Panin became consumed by a strange question. If you assign numerical values to the letters of the Hebrew and Greek alphabets, a very old practice called gematria, where every letter doubles as a number, do the numbers in the biblical text behave randomly, the way you'd expect from ordinary human writing? Or do they cluster again and again around specific values, especially multiples of 7? He decided to find out for himself, one word at a time, with no computer, no calculator, nothing but a pen and an obsessive amount of patience. Panin devoted the better part of 50 years to this project. By the time he died in 1942, he had produced more than 40,000 handwritten pages of numerical analysis, examining the vocabulary of Genesis, the genealogies in Matthew, entire books of the New Testament, letter by letter, word by word, looking for the number 7 woven into the architecture of the text. What he claimed to find was staggering, at least on its face. In the genealogy that opens the Gospel of Matthew, 17 verses, 72 distinct Greek vocabulary words. Panin calculated that the total numeric value of every word summed to a number divisible by 7. Not once. He broke the vocabulary into subgroups by starting letter and found that each subgroup, on its own, also produced a total divisible by 7. He did this across dozens of passages, in both Hebrew and Greek, and published volume after volume, insisting that no human author, let alone 40 different authors writing across 15 centuries, could have coordinated this by accident. Other writers picked up where Panin left off. A British theologian named E.W. Bullinger wrote an entire book called Numbers in Scripture, arguing that specific numbers, 7, 12, 40, carry consistent symbolic and structural weight throughout the Bible, appearing at a frequency that felt, to him, too deliberate to be coincidence. Decades later, radio Bible teacher Chuck Missler picked up Panin's work again and popularized it for a new generation, presenting the heptadic patterns in Genesis and Matthew as a kind of mathematical watermark, evidence, he argued, that the text carried a signature no human hand could have forged. Before going further, It's worth explaining what gematria actually is, because the term gets thrown around a lot without much clarity. In ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek, there was no separate set of numeral symbols, the way we have 1, 2, 3 today. Instead, each letter of the alphabet did double duty as a number. Aleph, the first Hebrew letter, was also the number 1. Bet, the second letter, was also the number 2. Once you got past the first 9 letters, they started standing in for tens, and then hundreds. The same was true in Greek. This wasn't a mystical add-on. It was simply how these languages wrote numbers before Arabic numerals existed. But it also meant that every single word, by pure accident of the alphabet, carried a numeric value the moment it was written down. Add up the letter values in a word and you get a number. Add up the numbers in a sentence, and you get a bigger number. This is gematria, the practice of treating that built-in numeric layer as potentially meaningful. And it's been used for everything from mystical Jewish commentary to simple wordplay for well over 2,000 years. It's also worth asking why the number 7 specifically became the obsession for people like Panin. The answer isn't mysterious. It's right there in the text itself. The creation narrative in Genesis is structured around 7 days. The Hebrew word for oath is built from the same root as the word for 7. 7 shows up in the flood narrative, in the instructions for building the tabernacle, in the feasts of the Hebrew calendar, in the symbolic structure of the book of Revelation, where 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls organize the entire vision. By the time Panin went looking for 7 in the letter values of the text, the number was already the most loaded symbol in the entire canon. He wasn't picking an arbitrary target. He was following a pattern that the authors themselves seemed to care about deeply, and asking whether that care extended all the way down into the mathematics of a language itself. That's actually a reasonable question to ask. The problem is what happened next. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the viral videos. Panin's methodology has been picked apart by scholars for decades, and not gently. One of the more thorough critiques came from Peter W. Dunn, a biblical scholar who went back through Panin's calculations line by line. What he found was a pattern of inconsistency dressed up as rigor. Panin, it turns out, didn't use one fixed system for converting letters into numbers. He had several, including a letter's place value in the alphabet, its traditional numeric value in gematria, and a third figure that combined the two. When one system didn't produce a multiple of 7, Dunn found instances where Panin appeared to switch to another system that did. When a particular set of letters didn't cooperate, he'd narrow or widen his sample until they did. This is a subtle but devastating problem, and it has a name in statistics, researcher degrees of freedom, or more colorfully, the Garden of Forking Paths. If you're allowed to choose which words count, which letters to include, which numeric system to apply, and which groupings to test, you can eventually find a pattern in almost any sufficiently large body of text, not because the pattern is real, but because you kept trying combinations until one worked. Critics have pointed out that this kind of after-the-fact pattern hunting can produce heptadic structures in phone books, in newspaper articles, in pretty much any long piece of writing, if you're motivated enough and flexible enough about your rules. There's a second problem, too. Ancient Hebrew and Greek didn't have separate number systems the way we do. The same letters used to write words were also used to write numbers, the way Roman numerals double as letters in English. That means gematria isn't some exotic secret code bolted onto the language. It's baked into how the alphabet already worked. Every word in every Hebrew or Greek text ever written, biblical or not, has a numeric value simply because the alphabet doubles as a number system. So finding numeric patterns in the Bible doesn't automatically mean something supernatural is going on. It might just mean you're looking at what happens when you run gematria analysis on any long text written in these alphabets. Defenders of Panin's work respond that the density and layering of the 7s he found go well beyond what chance would predict, and that critics haven't always successfully reproduced his most striking specific results as unprovable. That argument has never been fully resolved and probably won't be, because both sides are working from the same handful of ambiguous texts and different assumptions about what counts as a fair pattern. So where does that leave things? Not with a clean answer. Mainstream biblical scholarship and mainstream mathematics do not treat Panin's numerics as proven, and the field sits well outside the academic consensus in both biblical studies and statistics. At the same time, the phenomenon hasn't simply been debunked and forgotten. It's had 100+ years of ongoing argument. New books are still being published defending and refining Panin's approach, and the core observation that drove him, the number 7 really does show up with unusual frequency in the biblical text structure, is not seriously disputed. What's disputed is whether that frequency is a deliberate mathematical signature or a natural consequence of a culture that was already obsessed with the symbolism of 7, filtered through a researcher who kept searching until the numbers lined up. You don't need an imaginary AI experiment to check some of this today. Modern computational tools can and do run frequency analysis, letter value summation, and pattern detection across digitized biblical texts in their original languages. And this kind of work is genuinely being done by both believers and skeptics using real statistical methods. What that work generally finds is more modest than either the viral fiction or the most enthusiastic gematria writers claim. Some structural regularities do appear more often than a naive random model would predict. The 7 base patterns in Genesis 1 verse 1 and in short passages like the Matthew genealogy are real enough that they've been independently recalculated many times by supporters and critics alike, and the raw arithmetic checks out. What's contested isn't whether the numbers add up. It's whether adding up in isolated, carefully chosen passages tells you anything meaningful about the text as a whole, or whether it's closer to noticing that your license plate number, phone number, and street address all happen to contain a 3, if you're willing to hunt for it. This is a genuinely interesting epistemological problem, and it's one that shows up everywhere pattern recognition meets an ancient, symbolically dense text. The same debate happens around the Torah codes controversy of the 1990s. Where a peer-reviewed paper claimed to find encoded predictions in the Hebrew Bible using equidistant letter sequencing, only for statisticians to later demonstrate that similar codes could be generated from Moby Dick and War and Peace using the same methods. That doesn't prove biblical numerics is meaningless. It proves that humans are extraordinarily good at finding patterns, and that a pattern being real and a pattern being designed are two very different claims. And confusing them is one of the oldest mistakes in the study of any ancient text. There's a further wrinkle worth mentioning, because it shows up in almost every serious critique of this field: the multiple comparisons problem. If you test one specific hypothesis, say, does the sum of these 72 words divide evenly by 7? And it turns out true, that's mildly interesting. But if you instead test hundreds of possible groupings, subgroups, alternate numeral systems, and word selections, and only report the handful that happen to produce a multiple of 7, you haven't discovered a hidden pattern. You've run a lottery with enough tickets that someone was bound to win. Statisticians call this p-hacking when it shows up in scientific research, and the criticism leveled at Panin's 50 years of work is, in essence, exactly this: that a mind that patient and that motivated, searching a text that dense, was always going to find some subset that produced the number he was looking for, especially given how many different ways there are to slice up letters, words, and verses. The defenders of Panin's numerics respond that the sheer density of the patterns he found, 7s nested inside 7s, appearing at multiple levels of the same short passage simultaneously, is harder to wave away as coincidence than a single lucky grouping would be. Both sides have a point, and that's precisely why the argument has lasted more than a century without a decisive resolution. It's worth being direct about something. None of this is evidence that an AI chatbot decoded a hidden 4-step prayer protocol, or that researchers had breakdowns discovering it. That story borrows the aesthetics of real scholarship, a skeptical professor, a shaken graduate student, a probability calculation too extreme to be coincidence, because those beats make for a gripping video. But real gematria research doesn't look like that. It looks like Ivan Panin hunched over a desk for 50 years with a pen, producing 40,000 pages that took other scholars decades to even properly evaluate. It looks like academic papers with titles like A Statistical Approach to the Bible Codes Controversy, full of confidence intervals and null hypotheses, not shaking hands, and 3 a.m. phone calls. The actual history is slower, messier, and more honest than the fictional version. And honestly, that's what makes it worth telling. A Russian nihilist turned Harvard literary critic spends half a century convinced he's found God's fingerprint in the mathematics of ancient Greek and Hebrew. A century of scholars accuses him of counting the way a conspiracy theorist reads tea leaves. And somewhere in between, the number 7 really does keep showing up in the text of Genesis and Matthew in ways that are, at minimum, a genuinely curious feature of how these documents were composed. Whether that curiosity has a natural explanation, a cultural one, or something else, is a question nobody has closed the book on. Step back from the contested letter counting for a moment, because there's a layer of numerical meaning in the Bible that isn't controversial at all. It's just structural. And it's been recognized by Jewish and Christian scholars for thousands of years, long before anyone started running gematria calculations. 7 appears as the number of completion, the days of creation, the years of sabbatical release, the cycles of feasts. 12 appears as the number of covenant community, the tribes of Israel, the apostles, the gates of the New Jerusalem in Revelation. 40 appears as the number of testing and transition, the flood's 40 days of rain, Israel's 40 years in the wilderness, Jesus' 40 days in the desert. These aren't secret codes uncovered by mathematics.